3, 2, 1.
Today is April 10th, 2024. My name is Alexia Maria Orengo Green. I am interviewing Gabor Waldman on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation. The interview is taking place in Sao Paulo, Brazil. The language of the interview will be English. Can you introduce yourself, Gabor?
My name is Gabor Waldman. I was born in Hungary, Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary, in 1938, in the wrong time, wrong family, and the wrong place. Why? Because 4 months before I was born, the Nazi Germany occupied Austria. So suddenly, Hungary received a frontier with the Nazis. And 3 months afterwards, the Kristallnacht took place, the night of the crystals, which, when at this moment Jews in Germany and Austria, by then how Austria was part of Germany, in broad daylight, they were murdered in the streets and parks and the synagogues of Germany. And the wrong family because I was born in a Jewish family. So it couldn't be a worst case birth. What was your next question?
What was your name at birth?
At both, I was Gabor 40, and my father died. My mother remarried many years later, and my stepfather was Waldman, so that's why I got the Waldman name.
And can you tell me a little bit about your father?
My father was born in the interior of Hungary, a small town in Hungary, and he came to Budapest. He became a lawyer, took the university course, became a lawyer, and he was director of the Hungarian Italian Bank, which was one of the biggest banks in Hungary. But then in around 1941, 42, around that, it was forbidden for Jews to be more than managers, and he was a director. And so he was demitted. He started a private practice, and in 3 months' time, he was earning more money than he ever earned in the bank before. So for us, at that moment, in that moment even, Nazi Germany was helpful, if you can say that.
And can you tell me a little bit about his side of the family?
About
His side of the family, how his family was?
my mother's side, you mean?
Oh, your father's side.
Oh, my father's side. Well, they had a warehouse for agricultural products, and they lived off that. But my father was the only brother because he had, I think, two brothers and a sister. And he was the only one who came to Budapest and studied there, became a lawyer.
And what about your mother? Can you tell me a little bit about her?
My mother, they were also from the interior previously. They won the lottery ticket. Imagine that, a lottery ticket, and they came to Budapest. And in Budapest, they founded a milk processor and distribution company, and they lived off that. But my mother's father was Zweig. He was related to the Stefan Zweig family, who were the great writers in Czechoslovakia, not in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia. And that's about what I can say about my mother's side. To extend it a little further, my father, who had, of course, I had my grandmother, my grandfather, he had two brothers and a sister. They all got married. They had wives, children, my cousins. Not one single person survived. They were all murdered by the Holocaust. I'm the only survivor.
And how did you learn about what happened to them?
the following. When the German, well, let's start from the start. In 1920, about, Hungary became a fascist country. The fascists took over. Fascism is a light version of Nazism. They also hated the Jews, but they couldn't even have imagined doing some industrial extermination of the Jews as the Nazis did. They were anti-Semitic. They provoked their pogroms in Hungary. A couple of hundred Jews died, but so what? Of course, I'm being ironic now. So what? And after that, things got calmer, calmed down, and life continued the same as ever. So it was a light version of Nazis. No such thing as Holocaust was even imagined by them. Then in 1944, in the beginning of 1944, which means a year after the Stalingrad battle, it was quite clear by then to everybody, even to the Germans, that Germany has lost the war. They said to themselves, the Nazis, well, hell with it. Germany is lost, the war is lost, but we have to kill as many Jews as we can. At that moment, Hungary very secretly tried to make separate peace with the Russians and the Allies. And they started conversations. The Germans discovered it. In diplomacy, there's no such thing as a secret, you know that. And they invaded Hungary. Dismissed the fascist government of Hungary, and created a new Nazi-oriented government in Hungary. And when they invaded Hungary, they had a plan how to eliminate the Jews. And the plan began as the following. First, they would concentrate on Jews in the interior of Hungary. That doesn't mean that in Budapest they would be free. No, also in Budapest they would be persecuting Jews, but they give precedence to the Jews in the interior of the country. Why? Because logistically it was much easier for them. Concentration camps in Poland were closer to the interior of Hungary than Budapest itself. And second place, and more important, in a small city, a small town, 50, 70, 100,000 population, it's easy. If you have 5, 6, 10, or 15 collaborators, they can tell you where the Jews are living. In Budapest, which has more than 1 million inhabitants, it will be much easier, much harder to round up the Jews. So they gave preference to Jews in the interior of the country. And that means my father's family inside Hungary. That's why I lost my family, my whole family in the interior, and part of my family in Budapest.
And going back a little bit, were your parents religious?
No, they were not religious. They were not, no.
And do you know how your parents met by any chance?
No, not really. My father, how was it now? Yeah, my father was in Budapest already, and somebody introduced him to my mother, and then it happened.
And
They fell in love, you know.
and I know you've mentioned a little bit about your grandparents, but can you tell me a bit about what do you know about your grandparents or what you grew up hearing about them?
Well, on my mother's side, my grandfather was a banker, no, investment banker or something like that. He dealt with investment. Then the 29 crash came about, the famous 1929 crash, and he lost all his fortune. He lost everything. And not only that, but debtors, people who gave him money to administer, because it was a boom, you know. You remember, I don't know if you know that, but probably you do. It was a boom at that time with shares. And they lost everything also. They tried to sue my grandfather, and he tried to commit suicide. And he ran away from Hungary, went to Vienna. It was a very adventurous period. But the milk factory saved the family, which was from my grandmother's side, the milk factory. And so everything came to its place. And that's what I know from my mother's side. My mother's uncle was a very famous lawyer in Hungary, very famous lawyer in Hungary. And he also made a fortune by his own. And my father's side, I don't know anything because they all died. Only know that they had a warehouse. And that's about all I know. And my father came to Europe and became that lawyer which I told you about. One thing is important to say, mention is the following. Hungary entered the war on the German side because also they were fascists. They also hated the Jews. So it's obvious they made the alliance with Germany. And they entered the war in the German side, and they sent troops, lots of them, to the Russian front. And that's when it happened. Stalingrad came about in 1943. Then the Hungarians lost the whole army or something like that, and they had to retire, come back, pressed by the Russians, by the Soviets, and that's when they started to make peace with Russia, with the Soviet Union in those days. And that's when the Germans found it out, and the rest is I already know.
And can you tell me a little bit about your home growing up?
You're what?
Your home, where you, the apartment where you grew up?
Well, I grew up in lots of places because in 1945, when the war ended, then the persecution of Jews also ended. For that was a big relief. But the Soviet army established itself in Hungary, and slowly they converted Hungary to a Soviet satellite. We managed to survive till 1949, but by that time, persecution against bourgeois, against the middle class, was so strong, and we were a middle class family, so strong that my mother decided to run away from Hungary. And we ran away. We went to Austria, escaped to Austria. And from that, we tried to get away to somewhere overseas because Europe was a non-trustful country. Europe. We didn't trust Europe anymore. You couldn't trust them. What happened, all the things that happened, we tried to get away. And Brazil gave us a passport to come here. And we came to Brazil in 1951, end of 1951, beginning of 1952, something like that. Came to Brazil. My mother remarried here in Brazil. And I started going to school for the first time. And I took a business administration school in Brazil. I studied. I got my diploma. Then I went to Australia, and in Australia I stayed for nearly 2 years. I'm sorry, and then came to Brazil back, and here I started working in Brazil. And so first of all at Volkswagen, which was a car factory, Volkswagen, and then other companies. In 1974, I formed my own company, and from then on, I was never employed anymore. I became my own boss.
And kind of going back a little bit, did your mom ever describe to you the apartment before where you lived before the start of the war, um, before 1944?
Well, yes, we had a very nice, I remember it even. We had a very nice, very agreeable middle class family apartment. And the building where we were living was a 5-story building. And it was ours. The whole building was ours. And so we were quite well to do, quite well to do. And then we lost everything during the war and after the war. And so it was a very nice place. We had, I think, 3 or 4 bedrooms. I remember 3 bedrooms. And I was the only son of the sibling. And we lived comfortably. And my father had his own practice. He's a lawyer. And he had a very important client. And I remember that one of his clients was a general. Imagine a general hiring a Jew for as a lawyer. It was unheard of, but it happened. And this general was the counter spy, counter spy commander of the Hungarian army at that time. And so he knew all the secrets, all the connections of spying, both on the Russian, German, and the Hungarian side, that could be known. And the Russians came in. The first thing they do was to arrest him. Obviously, it was too precious for them. And then his widow, we didn't know she was a widow yet, his wife came to visit us to ask if we could find any documents that he may have left with my father. Of course, we didn't have any document left because we had to leave the building, we had to run away, and everything was bombed. And imagine the situation. So, unfortunately, we couldn't help her. But I know that he had some very important clients.
And how was your experience as a young child? Did you know about all of these important people that your father knew and had contact with, or was it something that you learned after and now? Yeah.
Well, look, we were persecuted. We were hungry. We were thirsty. There was no water to be had in Budapest after the Battle of Budapest started because the Soviet army and the Nazis. Water supply was cut off. And we were hungry, we were thirsty, we were cold, we were being persecuted. We didn't have a right place to sleep. A child, 6.5 years old, as I was then, doesn't know anything about death, the peril of being killed. I knew it was very uncomfortable, it was very unfortunate, and I wished it would stop. That's what I knew then, of course. And I knew also that my mother was very, very nervous and very, very scared. And so I got scared too, obviously. This is what I remember of those days. And then, of course, we escaped the Nazis, and the Russians came about. That wasn't as bad as the Nazis were, of course. They were not killing people in the streets, but it was pretty bad also, pretty bad. They nationalized our milk factory. They nationalized it. We had lost everything. We couldn't even take a bag away from there. Everything had to be left behind. And then we ran away from Hungary to Austria. That's what I remember, mostly.
And growing up in that neighborhood, do you have any friends that you remember?
Yes, after the war, I made some friendship. Um, I had some little friends, schoolboys, together with me studying. We're starting to study in those days. It was in 45, no study was to be had, because just after the war. 46 school started opening. And so I had some friends whom I visited afterwards in 1950, in 1964, was the first time I went back to Budapest. And then I revisited some of these friends. But as you can imagine, I had nothing in common with them. I had nothing in common with them. We had nice chats, we had nice conversations. We promised each other to correspond, but nothing of the sort happened. So I lost my friends back in Hungary.
And how was that experience about going back to Hungary? How did you feel?
Well, I found, of course, I still had very many parents there. My mother's sister, my mother's cousin was there. She had a daughter, and my who was there? My grand, no, grandmother wasn't there anymore. But I remember some other parents were there too. My mother's cousins, one or two of them. So I still had relatives back in Hungary then, and they received me very well, very nice. It was very nice talking to them and having a conversation and all that, and getting to know them, of course. And I kept up friendship with my mother's cousin for another couple of years. And when the pandemic started back in Brazil in the 2019, 2020, then I lost contact with them.
And growing up, do you have a sense of what kind of values you grew up with?
What kind of values?
Yeah.
What was the question?
Yes. If for example, if you had a sense of what kind of values you grew up with. So I know, for example, you mentioned that your parents were not religious, but were your grandparents religious, or how was it that in those early years up to 1944, what do you remember about your daily life with your parents, about how you were raised?
Well, look, I was raised as a Jew. I knew I was a Jew. It was very hard to ignore the fact after all the persecutions and the suffering. Of course, it was before the Nazis occupied Hungary, but still there were persecutions. I knew I was Jewish, but only Jewish holidays we kept up was Pesach and Yom Kippur, and that's about it. In the rest we weren't religious at all.
And I know we've kind of talked a little bit before, but as a young boy, what did you and your family know about the war?
As a young boy, what I knew about the war, I knew there was a war on. I didn't have much knowledge of what it means to have a war on. See, because then I was 5 years old, maybe six, or something like that. But I know I lost my father. I knew when my father was still alive, but somewhere as a forced laborer. And I was hoping that he would come back. Of course, I liked him very much. I wanted him to be back with us. And he was only coming once or twice, very rarely, on leave from the front. That was very rare. So I have very little memory about my father.
And were you able to stay in contact with him when he was away?
No, no contact. We did receive one or two postcards. I remember that one or two postcards we received, and that was about it.
And how did and how was life when he was not there? How were you and your mother doing during this time?
Well, we lost nearly everything because of bombings, and the building we were living in was bombed out. It was completely destroyed, which was our building, of course. It was destroyed. And we had my mother started working, and together with my uncle, my mother's sister, both started working. And that's it. That's how we lived. Of course, our living standard fell greatly after the war, very greatly. And then we ran away from Hungary. And then it was worse because we didn't know the language, we didn't have any family, we didn't have any friends, we had no money at all. What else do you want? It was a tough life, I must tell you. It was a very tough life. I only got to know what routine means, everyday life means, after my mother remarried again, which was around 1954, about 1954, when she remarried again. Then I got to know what it means to have a routine life. Because before that, I didn't know if I would have a lunch tomorrow. I didn't know where I would live in that 2 days' time. I didn't know anything. It's a complete loss of what will happen to me tomorrow.
And you mentioned that when your father left, your mother had to start working. Do you remember what she was working with?
Yes, I remember. There was let's say, a change store in Budapest, but 4 or 5 stores, as far as I remember, which were selling food stuff to dairy product it was. And the family didn't come back. They were killed by the Holocaust, at the Holocaust. And the some of the family did come back, but it was either very old people or very young people. I don't remember, and they were looking for somebody who could take care of their shops. And they got to know my uncle, my mother's brother, very well, and so they asked if we could work in their stores, and we did. We did. I mean, I didn't, but my mother and my uncle did, and they managed to recreate the shops, this chain of shops, 4 or 5 shops, something like that. And that they were doing that when the communists came in, and they came into the factory. Said, "Look, from now on, this factory will belong to the state. Please leave." That was all they said. And then my uncle, I remember, I was told, started stretched his arms to get his handbag, whatever it was. No, no, it has to stay. Just you can leave with your coats on. That's how we lost the job. And the family lost their jobs as owners.
And you kind of mentioned it briefly again before, but were you aware of any anti-Jewish policies that were happening in Budapest before 1944?
Well, what I learned was that my father had to he had lost his job, and the family was desperate. What will happen next? And what happened next was a very, very lucky thing that he got his private practice going, and so that's what I noticed. I noticed that my mother was very nervous that some things were happening. I noticed that they started distributing um, cards, what you call it, ration cards, and people could only buy food and other stuffs by ration. And we couldn't get it because we were Jewish, and Jews weren't permitted to get the ration card. And so things were going from bad to worse, and from worse to even worse. That's what I knew.
And can you tell me a little bit about the day the Germans entered Budapest?
The day,
The day that Nazi Germany entered Budapest.
tremendous noise. I remember tremendous noise of rails cutting across the pavement, and the German troops coming in, trucks coming in, tanks coming in, armored cars coming in and making a hell of a noise because the wheels, those chains. And that's what I remember mostly. And everybody scared stiff around me. That's what I remember. And then, of course, hell broke loose. All hell broke loose.
And did you have any interactions, or how did life change afterward?
After what?
So how did life change after the entering of the Germans?
Oh,
I know
well,
you mentioned that there was a lot of noise and that people were scared, but how was it?
yeah, well, that was the hell broke loose, as I just said. From the first day on, after I came into Budapest, um, uh, laws were announced against the Jews. Jews couldn't have this and couldn't have that. Were sent away from their jobs. There were retirement wages stopped being delivered. Um, they couldn't have pets. They couldn't go onto the streets after, I think, they could go to the streets to buy stuffs which I needed from 6 to 7, I think, after, in the late afternoon, where shops were mostly closed already. And we could only go to the streets 6 to 7. They couldn't have any intellectual life. Theaters, movies, public places, all stopped receiving Jews. And if you were caught, you were taken to a concentration camp. What else? Um, and of course, the persecution itself. They were started to be rounded up, sent to the ghettos. And the ghettos we knew already. The ghettos were the stepping stone towards the concentration camps. At the concentration camps, we knew already that they existed, but we didn't know yet what was happening there. We didn't know about anything about the gas chambers, of course. But we knew already that good things were not happening there. Coming from the Nazis, no good would be happening anywhere for Jews. And so we had to move from our place where we lived. We moved to it was something very interesting because it was only in Budapest I know that it's happened. In no other city in the world, in Europe, is the following. The neutral countries were allowed to buy or rent buildings which they put under their consular or embassy protection. That means that they rented a two-story or three-story building. They put an embassy employee in there to protect the place. And they emitted laissez-passer, what you call laissez-passer, passports or permits for people persecuted by the Nazis to go into the building. And of course, not only Jews were there, but also other people, politicians who were against the Nazis and so on. So they could go into the buildings and stay there, protected by the respective countries. But of course, let's say we went to a Swiss building. Switzerland was neutral in the war. We went to a Swiss building. But in a building that could fit, let's say, 20, 30 people, there were 500 in there. Imagine the thing we had to live through. For example, you couldn't go to sleep. We had to sleep, let's say, from 8 to 11, group 1, go to sleep. The rest had to be standing up or kneeling down. And I don't know how my mother managed to explain to a 6-year-old boy, the fact that I couldn't go to sleep. But somehow she managed to. Children grow up in hardship, grow up, becomes young adults. And anyway, so we had to stay there for some time. But we were very afraid because we knew one thing, that the Swiss had their neutral status, which of course was very good. Their protection was more or less accepted by the Nazis. But there was only one country which had a, let's say, more full-fledged protection, which was the Spanish protection. Why Spanish? Because Spain was the only country who not only remained neutral during the war, but they also recognized the Nazi government of Hungary. The other countries were neutral, but they did not recognize the Nazi status of Hungary. And so the Spanish were more or less more protected. So we managed to get a permit to go to a Spanish protected place, which was very, very difficult to get, very difficult to get. But my mother was able to get it. We moved there, and 3 days later, the whole Swiss building, the inhabitants there were taken to the Danube and killed there, shot there. So if we had them taken 3 days longer, I wouldn't be giving this interview to you.
And how was it that you first got into the Swiss house?
How is that?
How did you first get into the Swiss protected house?
How I went to the Swiss protected house? Well, we bought, I think we bought, I don't remember exactly. I think we bought this permit, this permission, bought it or received it. I don't remember anymore. And then the Spanish was very curious. It was very curious, the Spanish. Imagine what happened. To get the Spanish permit would cost a fortune. We didn't have that fortune by that time. We were quite poor by then, of course. Everything was confiscated and so on. And my mother's uncle, by affinity, he married my mother's cousin. He was a doctor, a urologist, and he was head of the urology department at the clinic at the clinical hospital, the main hospital in Budapest. And he lost his job because of a Jew, but he remained as an apprentice, a urology apprentice. Why? Because he had, in the First World War, he was a soldier, and he got the most important condecoration of the First World War for bravery. It was called the Maria Theresa Distinguished Cross. And that was the only thing the Germans respected for a certain time. Afterwards, they're in the queue of the Holocaust, the back queue of the Holocaust. It will come to that term too, obviously. And he one day, a soldier came into his department, into his sector where he was practicing, and he had a very strange uniform on. And so this uncle of my mother asked him, well, what uniform is this? He said, I'm from the Spanish army, from the Condor division, which Franco, which was the dictator of Spain, sent in order to fight on the German side against the Russians. That was the only thing he did during the war. And he was a soldier, a very important officer of that division. And he got a venereal disease, syphilis or something of the sort. And so my uncle, my mother's uncle, started treating him. And he cured him. In those days, cure of syphilis was very, very difficult. There was no penicillin, there was no sulfa, there was nothing there. The only thing he could do is to widen the urethra, which is well, whatever. And he was cured. This guy managed to cure him. And he said, look, I can't pay you because I have no money here in Budapest, but I'm a rich man back in Spain. So this relative of mine said, look, I don't need any cure, any money from you. Just get me 4 or 5 permits to the Spanish embassy, the protected building. And he got a couple of these permits. And he managed to send to my family, to where we were, to my mother and myself, 2 of these permits. That permitted us to go to the Spanish place. And that saved our life. So Francisco Franco was a goddamn son of a bitch, I'm sorry to say it. I don't know if I can say that in English, but thanks God he existed. He saved my life. He was a cursed guy because he recognized the regime of Hungary. For this, I deplore him. But the fact that he saved my life, I admire him.
And before you went to the Spanish house and your uncle offered you and your mother those permits to go to the Spanish house, did anything happen in the Swiss house that made you and your mother being let's switch to the Spanish house?
You mean, I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah. Before you go to the Spanish house and your uncle gives you the permit that he was able
Swiss
to get,
house, yeah.
how was life in the Swiss house? How did anything happen during that time that you were there that made you and your mother want to switch houses?
Well, we switched houses mostly because we knew it was more protected. That we already knew, that it was more protected than the Swiss house. In the Swiss house we went was the conditions were terrible there. It was, as I told, there was no space whatsoever. We had some more space in the Spanish house. We could at least lie down and rest. Food was absolutely non-existent in the Swiss house, and we had more food in the Spanish house. We had a maidservant who served with us for many, many years before had to be sent away because Jews couldn't have maids. And she was at our place already when I was born, and she raised me practically and so on. And she had a ration card, and she had a very small ration for whatever food there was left in Hungary by that time, and she shared it with us. She shared it with us, and that we could eat something at least. And then one day a bomb fell close to her, and she broke her arm. And she broke her arm and couldn't come to our building. And then we had no food nearly whatsoever. We had some little food, but very little, for 2 or 3 weeks before she recovered. And during these 2 or 3 weeks, my mother heard what no mother in the world should ever hear. Mommy, I'm hungry. And she couldn't do anything but to give a massage to my stomach. So it was horrible. Then we got to the Spanish house, and the condition was a little bit better in the Spanish house. I don't know if I answered your question.
You did. And in the Swiss house, did your mother or you befriend anyone there, or was there anyone that you knew from beforehand?
No, no, I don't remember anybody I knew beforehand. It was only my mother and myself. My uncle wasn't there either. He was somewhere else. I don't know where. He survived the war, but I don't know where he was.
And you mentioned that in the Spanish house, the conditions were much better.
Not much better, a little bit better.
A little bit better. Um, can you speak about your time there a little bit more? And did they give you food, or was it again with the rationing that someone had to bring food?
Yeah, but there was a little bit more food. The Spanish embassy sent up some food, if you can call it food, by the way. Anyway, our maid was the one who replaced whatever was missing. She replaced it. But you see, food in those days, we called it Ersatz. Ersatz in German means substitute food. For example, bread. There was no such thing as grain, which bread is made of, which you may know. What we had was barks of trees and things like this, grinded, and they made some food of some bread of it. But it was no bread at all. But it filled your stomach, and there was some protein to be had through it. That was all we had. And some other things, I don't remember what, but it was no food at all. We called it food because it's optimistic, but we only called it. But anyway, we survived on it.
And can you describe the house itself, how it was?
And which house do you mean? Where I lived before, or the Spanish and the Swiss house? I don't remember anything of them. I know it was small houses, and that's all I remember. I can't remember the houses themselves. The house we lived at before was a very nice place. It was owned by us, 5 stories, and we lived on the 3rd floor. My mother and myself and my father lived on the 3rd floor. And then when bombing started, when the Allies started bombing Budapest, which was in 1942, we had to go to the basement. And then one day we're in the basement, the air raid was on. We heard tremendous explosions, and the bombs got our building. The building was destroyed. The first 2 floors were destroyed. I mean, the last 2 floors were destroyed. Our store, which was 3rd floor, was more or less kept safe, but more or less. And then we could stay there for another couple of weeks or months, I don't remember, after which we had to leave and to go to this protected house. It was too dangerous to stay there. And of course, the building was practically destroyed. So we lost our building also. And I remember my grandfather, no, it was my great grandfather, who was then about 90 to some years old, when he emerged from the basement with all the families and everybody around him, looked up, saw that absolute destruction, saw the fires burning upstairs and all that. He said the following: God gave, God took it. He must have been religious because he talked about God. God gave it, God took it away, or God take it. Let's go and work. And he went up with all the people and started putting out the fire and making it habitable. The three first floors, which were downwards, they made it habitable. But he talked about God.
Did you have then a good relationship with your neighbors?
Yeah, as far as I remember, yes. I didn't have any relationship with anybody. I was too small for that. But my parents had no problem with relationships.
And going back to, before we continue, for the Spanish house and the Swiss house, do you remember how much time you were in both?
Well, let me see. In the Swiss house, we stayed something like weeks, so maybe a month or two. In the Spanish house, more time. Then we stayed about a year, maybe. No, less than a year, because the Germans came into Hungary in 1944, in February or March 1944. And the war for us ended in January 1945. So that was about 11 months, let's say a year. And in that year, we took some time before we left our old house. Then went to a Swiss house. We must have stayed there for about a month. So I would say in the Spanish house, we stayed for about 10 months. 9, 10 months, something like that.
And when did you leave the Spanish house? Did you leave it then
We left the Spanish house after the Battle of Budapest stopped. After the Battle of Budapest was off, the Russians took hold of Budapest, which was a very raging battle was there, tremendously raging battle. And they defeated the Nazi army. That must have been around January 1945. And then we got to know that our building with the first three stories were still habitable, and we went back to the old building.
And what did you encounter when you went back to your building?
Destruction, absolute, complete, and unredeemable destruction. And we managed to get there, and we managed to make it a habitable place. That's what I remember.
And did you encounter anyone else when you got back to your building?
Yes, some people who were old habitants of the buildings were still there. New ones came in, and our family, of course, and that's more or less what it was.
And how was life being back in that building after the Swiss house and the Spanish house?
Well, I was very happy with it because, of course, I was accustomed to that building because that's where I started I spent my first 5 years. So I was happy to be back. But of course, it was so destroyed, it was nearly unrecognizable as it was. Then it was more or less reconstructed, but it took about a year or two before it was more or less reconstructed. It was taken away from us, the building, was nationalized, and then we ran away. I had 1 or 2 friends there, yes. I had, I think, 2 friends there. Yeah, little boys like I was.
And how was that experience with your two friends?
I don't remember anymore. I know that one of them stayed back in Hungary, and the second one, he was ill. He had a Down syndrome. You know Down syndrome. He had Down syndrome. He was older than I was, much older, 10 years old or something like that. And with him, I didn't have much contact, very little contact. I remember we used to listen to music together. I had a small record player, and we heard some music together. That's all I remember of him.
And were they also Jewish?
Were there ever? I think so. I think so.
And when you went back to your apartment, were a lot of your belongings that you had left still
Nothing
there,
at
or were
all.
there?
Nothing at all. Completely deployed. Nothing. We had we had to. But she didn't buy anything in those days. We traded things. You want a pullover, let's say, overcoat. I went on the street and there were some people selling, not selling, because money was worthless. We had no money. The money that we had was worthless. And so we traded. We had something left, and so we gave it back, give it to the guy. The guy gave us that overcoat and things like. It was back to the cave ages. You see, we traded.
And how, and were you participating also in that trading with your mother, or was your mother doing it on her own?
Doing what?
Were you with your mother when your mother would be doing the trading?
No, I wasn't. I don't remember. Details like that, I can't remember anymore. I was too young then, 6 years old, not even seven yet.
And how long did you stay in your apartment?
Oh, by the way, I remember one detail which may interest you. As I told you, my father's a lawyer, and so I had a very big library, law books. Nobody was interested in law books, so the books stayed back there. Uh, that was the only thing that was probably there was the only thing left in the building with in the apartment was the books, my father's books. So everybody was doing something. Everybody's selling things. I mean, trading things and or working in the buildings, destroyed buildings, trying to reconstruct or at least take the ruins away. And so I got my father's books. I put them on a table on the corridor, and I put a sign there. I don't remember who wrote the sign because I couldn't read or write then, saying that books are for sale, law books, laws which didn't even exist anymore. The laws before war law was completely obsolete, completely out of practice. And I was sitting there waiting for somebody to come and buy the books. I must tell you, I didn't have much success in this first business business venture of mine.
Being an entrepreneur.
Entrepreneur, yeah.
And how were you passing time when you were back in your apartment?
How I passed my time.
Yeah.
Well, in the beginning, I started to get my trusted to try to put my toys in order, try to help my mother in removing the ruins of the apartment. And then, of course, I started school a year later, more or less a year later, school started. And when school started, I didn't have a clue. I was about 8 years old already, and I didn't have a clue what it means, what it meant to study. I didn't know what I was studying. I didn't go to kindergarten. Didn't go to first 2 years of schooling. Nothing of the sort. So I was a very bad student. I couldn't get down to school to school. The job of doing schoolwork. And the only subject I was very good at, I was excellent at, was history, Hungarian history. I loved Hungarian history. And I always got top notes in history. My history teacher called me my little historian. Well, so I got the top notes in history, and all the rest were completely under the grade school notes. And I remember one thing that in 1940, I was already at top notes, I already said that. In 1948 or 49, my mother, I got back my bulletin, what do you call it, my exam report, and history was always top note. It was the best note was 10, and the worst note was 0, and I had 5. So annoyed, my mother ran into school and went to talk to the history teacher. What happened? I mean, the only subject where top notes, then I had 5 now, which was mediocre. And the history teacher got up from the table, went to his door, his place, his office door, closed the door, went back and sat down and said the following: "Madam, what I'm going to tell you now, I'm not here to repeat again. Don't repeat it to anybody. But the Communist Party gave us orders that children of bourgeois people, middle class people, cannot get more than 5 in their grades. So they started persecuting children. That's when my mother decided that this is not a place to stay. No. And that's when she decided to run away from Hungary. Of course, there are many other reasons too. Let's not exaggerate. But she said, at least to me, that this was the main reason that she decided to leave. I could, of course, not having good grades, I couldn't even think of university. So I would become let's say, mechanic or whatever, because I couldn't study university. You see, communism was not heaven either.
And what did you understand that was happening around you?
When?
During this period, did you understand what was happening, or what did you think about life during this moment?
Well, I already knew. I was about 8, 9 years old, so I knew that things were going badly. I knew that the milk factory was taken away from us. I knew that things were not going well, and but that's about all. And I knew that the Russian army has taken power of Hungary. This is what I knew.
So we are about 1 hour in. Would you want to take a short break?
If I want to take a short break, yeah, we can take. Yeah, all right, a very short one.
We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll
but it's 2 or 3 minutes only.
Yeah.
I bring some water.
Yeah, to drink some water, yeah.
Okay, should I cut the camera?
Yes, yeah, we can cut and then resume in 2 minutes. Thank you.
All right, we're online.
We're back. So we were just speaking a little bit about your experiences at school too. Shall we continue with that conversation? I know you just mentioned that you wanted to also mention something important here.
Mention something what?
Before we started, you mentioned that you have remembered something.
Yeah, what? If I remember about remembering something.
Oh yeah, before we connected, you said that you wanted to say something too.
I don't remember now.
Oh, no worries, no worries. So we were talking a little bit about your experience as a child at school, and I wanted us to go a little bit back. Can you tell me a bit about the day you were liberated?
The day I was,
liberated?
I don't have a clue when it was, because there was no such as a liberation day. The Germans receded um, gradually. For example, our street, our house where we were living at, it was taken over by the Germans and the Russians 3 or 4 times. The Russians rushed in and the Germans receded. The Germans came back and the Russians had to go out, and then they came back and the Germans were defeated. But there was no such thing as a day when the Germans were defeated. They retired. Um, they retired partially during the battle. And then finally they disappeared. But they could come back any minute again. They bombed the city, and the Russians came back and bombed the city, and then they made incursions to the city that they didn't do anymore. We didn't know when we would be liberated. So it happened gradually.
And how were you feeling during this moment too of uncertainty?
Oh, it was horrible. The battle was horrible. It was a very fierce battle in Budapest, very fierce battle. It was the last capital of a foreign country, a country the Germans had in their hands. So they were very, very fearful about keeping this capital. All the others were lost already, except for their own. Vienna and Berlin were still in their hands. And they tried to hang on to Budapest by any means. And so it's a very fierce battle. And of course, there was hunger, there was thirst, there was danger, there was bombs falling, the bullets flying around. You can imagine a street battle.
And how, so as a child, you were watching all of this battle taking place just outside of your apartment then in the street?
In the streets, inside the house itself, it was everywhere, a battle everywhere.
So you have, during the battle, do you have any interactions with the soldiers from both sides?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. But now I remember what I wanted to tell you. The German side, of course, no. German side was impossible because there were Nazis, they were anti-Semitic and all and so on. And the ones who weren't, because of course there were many Germans who were not anti-Semites and not Nazis at all. They were simply had to go into the army and fight, and that's all. But who would know who is and who isn't? So when the Russians came in, I got to know a Russian soldier whose name was Victor. And he was a Mongolian. And I made friendship with him. Russian soldiers in general like children very much. Children and dogs. The Russian army was also accompanied by hordes of children and hordes of dogs where they came about. And it was very nice to me, and I learned Russian with him. I even spoke some Russian in those times. And he showed me a tank in the inside of a tank which he operated. And so it was very nice to get to know him. And he bought us some food too, some food. But he stayed around for a couple of months. Then he left with the Russian army back towards the west, to Germany. And he was killed there. In Germany, Austria, somewhere he was killed during the battle.
And how did your friendship with him begin?
How first?
How did your relationship, your friendship with him begin?
Chleba. Chleba in Russian means bread. I asked him for bread. Chleba, dawaj chleba. Give me bread. And that's how it started. And then he lived in our building, whatever was left of it, for a couple of weeks, because the Russian army, they tried to convince Hungarians to keep Russians in their homes. One way of having the Russian army being well received by the population. And so he stayed in our building a couple of, I don't know if it was weeks or months, at a neighbor's apartment. And that's how I got to know him. Slowly, I started speaking to him in Russian because I learned some words. He said, chassis, 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 which means watch in Russian, chassis. And that's how I learned my Russian.
And I know you mentioned a little bit before that the bourgeois started to be persecuted, and you gave the example of, for example, of your class grade in the history class before. Can you talk a little bit more about those things that you began to notice in that aspect?
I don't exactly know what you mean by this, but I know about outside what.
You mentioned before that your mother started to notice, for example, that because of your social class.
Yeah, social class, yeah.
Yeah, can you tell me a little bit about the other things that were happening that you noticed maybe around you or that your mom noticed that were happening in addition to what you said before?
Yeah, but at school they started praising whatever the Russians were doing. By that time, Cold War has started already, famous Cold War, and so everything the United States or allies, Western Europe, were doing was wrong, criminal, and everything the Soviet Union was doing was good and praiseful. And of course, I didn't quite agree with it. I couldn't argue because I was about 8 or 9 years old, but I couldn't argue. But I knew it was wrong. It was not the right thing to do. And so I argued with some of my school friends, which didn't help me much either, because of course they discovered that I was, let's say, a class enemy, as they would call it, a class enemy. But the most devastating thing that happened to me, I don't know if I told you this already, and if you're coming to this subject, is the fact that happened to me when I was 27 years old. Did I tell you?
About the person that you met in Brazil? Yeah. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that.
That too. All right. So I didn't know if you want to come to that.
We'll talk about it a little bit later. But do you have but during this time, for example, how was life in Budapest with the Soviet occupation?
Well, in the beginning, it was quite democratic. Democracy was replaced by a dictatorship, and that was very nice. And foodstuffs starting slowly to come back to the market. So by 1946, we had simple but meaningful and nourishing food to be had already. Things started coming back to normal. Rubble started to be taken away from the streets. Dead bodies were cleared up. Buildings were, if not reconstructed yet, but at least they became, let's say, decent to look at. It wasn't a complete rubble, as they were before. People started coming back from the war. And of course, we were expecting my father to come back, but he didn't, as you know. And so life started to come back to normal. People started working, and so did my mother, my uncle, as I told you. And I went to school, started going to school. It was horrible to go to school, but I didn't know what it means. I didn't know what it was meaning. I didn't know how to study and all that. And it was, but life started to come back to normal. Then, suddenly, the Russians, the communists in Hungary, no, not necessarily Russian, the communists in Hungary, started cutting slice by slice freedom away. free elections were stopped. This communist party became absolutely dominant in the country. When we had still got free elections, the communists got very little of the vote. See, the Communist Party got very little of the vote. And then started getting majority. They started incorporating other parties, like the Social Party, was the independent party. They merged with the socialists, because they forced the merger, to the forced merger. But still, they merged, and so become a dominant party by then. And they took power away at parliament and from the non-communists, and they started voting laws which was to their agreement. And the Soviets' agreement. Stalin was the dominant figure of the day. See? And he was a psychopathic murderer.
You mentioned before that going back to school was not something that you were enjoying, and
No.
that you were having and that you were having disagreements with other kids in school. Can you tell me a little bit about those interactions?
Well, for example, there was one friend of mine in the classroom whose parents seemed to be communistic, or at least they had communist sentiments. And he said that, how was it now? I asked, we were talking about the West and the East. The Western countries, which are anti-communist, and the Eastern countries, which are in favor of communism. And I asked him, why doesn't the Russian army take hold of Western Germany? I asked, provocatively. I was provoking him. He said, because the Soviet Union wants peace. It desires peace. So these kind of things, and it was a kind of a conversation stopper. See, they want peace. And he was mad at me because I was suggesting something different. These kind of conversations, but just childish conversations. I was 8 years old maybe then, or maybe 9. Not meaningful.
And were these conversations that were surrounding the communist population and the Soviets, were those things that you were also hearing maybe your mother talking about, or other adults in your life also speaking about it?
Yeah, they hated the Russians, but at the same time, they admitted that the Russians saved our lives a couple of years before. But they hated communism, they hated the Russian army meddling in some things that they shouldn't meddle in, Hungarian politics and so on. They hated Stalin, they hated the communist regime. I knew that, although they tried to keep it away from me in secret. By half-word conversations, by insinuations, I gathered the fact that they were not doing any good to our family.
And during this time, you've been in your apartment for a little bit. You started school during this time. Have you heard about yet what had happened to your father?
We didn't have any clue of my father. He just disappeared. My mother waited for him to come back, and then we had no more hope for him to come back. And then something happened. Somebody came back from the concentration camp, and he took a list of the people around him who were killed. And he had his name on his list. So it's two things. One is this list, and the second, the fact that he didn't come back.
And how did your mom and you feel when you saw this list?
Well, I don't remember that. I don't even remember quite how it came about. I know it happened, but I don't know how exactly. And my mother slowly, step by step, accepted the fact that my father would not come back. You see, in those days, it was so different from today's. Today, somebody is very ill, then you know that this person could recover or simply die, either of the two things. And so you expect him to survive. But in those days, not surviving, being killed and being murdered or being killed was the order of the day. And it was so natural. To survive was non-natural. You see, it was the complete upside down what was happening in real life today, the normal life. We knew that most people didn't survive. So it wasn't a surprise really when my father was not coming back. And my mother accepted the fact.
And in addition to, so you knew that now you had learned that your father had half. Did you learn about his side of the family dying in a similar way, or just because of the geography, as you had mentioned before?
They didn't come back. Nobody came back. So we knew that they were murdered also.
And what about your family that survived? How did you learn that they had survived?
Because I was in Hungary. I was there. So I met them. We had nice conversations. We had some meetings, family meetings, and that's how I got to know it.
And after the war, when was it that, in what year was it that your mom decided to leave Hungary?
Well, it was also a slow process, you see, because in the beginning, 1946, 47, we were living quite well. Of course, we didn't go back to that old standard of living which had before, but it was acceptable living standard. And then slowly they started cutting away our whatever we had left by that time. My mother and my uncle stopped having a job. They stopped having things were confiscated, and so we knew that things were going from bad to worse. And by 1948, sometime, my mother decided to defect from Hungary. And then this report thing happened, which I told about already, and she said that she got the boot from that time.
And where did you go?
We ran away. We had a smuggler who smuggled us out of Hungary to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was also a communist country, but in there, the communists took power about a year before. They couldn't have fortified frontiers yet. They didn't have watchtowers yet. And so it was still let's say, in the beginning stage of communism. And from Czechoslovakia, we ran away to Austria. That's how it happened.
And do you remember a little bit about the time that you were in Czechoslovakia?
The time when?
Do you remember a little bit about the time that you were in Czechoslovakia, how Czechoslovakia was,
in Czechoslovakia, we lived in a place where refugees were held. It was a shanty town and horrible place. But we stayed there only for a couple of weeks in Bratislava. It wasn't in Prague, it was in Bratislava, which is another city in Czechoslovakia. And then we ran away. We had to go afoot. It was very hard, very difficult, but we managed to get to Austria.
And were the other refugees, were they also Jewish?
Oh yeah, there were many, because this region, this place in Bratislava, which was a shanty town, as I said, it was a district where even the police wouldn't dare to enter, see, because it's so badly known and badly considered that even the police were afraid of entering the place. But we had to live there because it was the only place we would stay at.
And you mentioned that to get to Czechoslovakia, you had a smuggler. How was that experience as a young child of having?
It was a very bad experience because he stayed with us, and he tried to go steady with my mother. And my mother didn't have anything to do with him. And that was some problem. But then we got to Austria. He still visited us a couple of times. Of course, my mother was afraid to tell him, look, get the hell out of here, because she was afraid, because these smugglers were dangerous people. And even though they were anti-communists, but they were very dangerous. And she, let's say, she slowly gave the boot to this chap, slowly. And then he died. We got to know that he was in a frontier battle with the police, the frontier guards. He was killed. But my mother had some difficult time with him.
So was he also then the smuggler that got you both into Austria then?
Then we got to Austria. Then we were free.
And how was the experience about arriving in Austria after being in Hungary, then the experience for 2 weeks in Czechoslovakia?
Well, it was hellish bad. It was very bad. Imagine a situation for a young boy like I was. Then I was 11 years old. No money, no school, no language, no friends, no place, decent place to live in. I mean, it was really something very bad, very, very unfortunate. So the only thing I could do is look at the ceiling and do nothing. Nothing. I was afraid to leave to the street because I didn't know the place, and I was afraid to get lost. And I didn't know the language either. So I had absolutely nothing to do. But then something curious happened. I loved to read very much. I was a very good reader. And I loved Hungarian history. So I had a good, let's say, a reasonable cultural background. And I started writing a book in Hungarian. That took up my life in Austria, writing a book. And I wrote a book, childish book, of course, but I still have the book, and I have it on me right now. I can even show it to you afterwards. It was written in Hungarian, so nothing to be read about it, but still I wrote a book.
What was the book about?
It was a book about spying, about spies. Of course, I was well versed in the subject, because Austria in those days, half of the population of Austria was spying on somebody else. It was, spies were dominating the place. So I wrote about this.
And were you able, during the time in Austria, in addition of writing your spy book, were you able to befriend anyone?
Yeah, well, after about a year passed by, I became a student in Salzburg. We moved from Vienna to Salzburg. And in Salzburg, I already knew German enough to be able to go to school, but not as an enrolled schoolboy, but as a listener, just to listen. So I didn't participate in exams. I didn't participate in anything that had notes to do with notes. I just listened. And I got to learn German. And that's where I learned German. And about a year or 2 years later, I left for Brazil.
And Can you tell me a little bit more about your experience in the school? Was it a public school or how? Yeah.
It was a public school. We didn't have money to pay for it. We didn't have any money practically. And it was a public school. And I was there listening to what was happening and learning German, which was the most important part of it. And I got to learn German very well. Children
And
learn languages like hell. Easy, easy, easy. So then I came to Brazil, and here I had to learn all over again Portuguese.
and how was where did you live in when you were in Austria? How was it an apartment? Was it a house? Was it different
Well,
from?
we were living in dismal conditions. There was a thing called refugee committee in Austria, and this refugee committee, they could give you, let's say, an apartment or a camp, refugee camp. They gave us a hotel. They didn't give us the hotel. They gave us a room, a rundown eighth category hotel in Vienna. See, it was a very bad place, very small, and underneath the ground. It was in the basement. It was also horrible conditions. Then we got to Salzburg. My mother, already working, made enough money to rent a room, just one room. Rent a room in a small pension. I think it was a pension, yeah. And so we started living there in acceptable conditions.
And what was your mother working on?
My mother became a saleswoman. She was selling things, and that's what she was living on.
And how would you have any interactions with um, the local people in Salzburg or Vienna? How was it the daily life?
Well, look, in Vienna was very little interaction because I didn't know the language. I started to learn the language. Uh, bad things happened there. For example, there was a United States military camp very near to where I was living there. No, that was in Salzburg already. We had a very small, in Salzburg, I think this happened in Salzburg already. A military camp was Russia, for American soldiers were posted. And one day I was walking there, and I had 3 or 4 children, Austrian children, walking before me, and they were quarreling. They had a small fight among them, and I was just listening back, a couple of steps back, and one of them turned to the other and said, "Du Jude, you Jew," you know, giving a lay of hand. That's, "You're a Jew," and that was very bad for me to hear, because I knew that I was one of the Jews he was talking about. And so that was a very unhappy thing that happened. And some things like this happened. But then I started learning really German, and then these things stopped happening. I lived a more or less normal life in Austria. I missed it when I left for Brazil.
And why do you think that it was you learning German that made this interaction stop?
Now, because the children I was together with, my companions in school, when they knew that I was speaking German already, they took care not to talk about these things. Parents at home told them nothing to say about the Jews, because this is forbidden now. I guess that this must have happened.
And you said that when you left for Brazil, you missed your time there. What was the thing that you missed the most during your time in Austria?
I missed my parents. I'm not my parents. I missed my relatives. I lived my old friends. I lived the language I learned how to speak. I lost everything. Completely unrooted. Completely unrooted.
And what was it? How long did you ended up being in Austria?
How was it to be?
How how much time were you in
Oh, in
Austria?
Austria. I got there in 49 and I stayed till 51, 50, end of 51, it's beginning of 52.
And
2 or 3 years.
and what was it that prompted the decision to go to Brazil?
To Brazil, we want to try to leave, by all means, Europe. We couldn't get a passport to United States or to Canada or to Australia or to New Zealand, which we were trying. Anglo-Saxon country was my mother's ideal. We couldn't go there because we had no family. We had no um, caretaker of the family. And only men could be caretakers of the family. Women were not allowed, which is another discrimination against women, of course. Only men. And my mother was unmarried, was a widow, so she couldn't get her visa to any place, any decent place. Brazil was not a decent place. It's hard to say it now because now I'm a Brazilian citizen living here for 70 years, or I don't know how much. But in those days, it wasn't a decent place to come to. We were expecting to see snakes on the streets. Of course, nothing of this happened, but we were expecting it. And so we came to Brazil and we missed Austria very much. And when we were in Austria, we missed Hungary very much. It was not easy to be a refugee.
And how was the journey to Brazil?
Well, Brazil was really non-eventful. Non-eventful. We came and we just landed in Sao Paulo. We had some people I knew in Sao Paulo, friends, acquaintances. And so there were people who waited for us and who gave the first helps, first moments of help in Brazil. And some of these people deceptioned us very much later on. And but some of them we kept up friendship with. And I started learning the language, and by the end I learned the language, and then we were completely accepted Brazilian society. And there's one more important thing: there's no such thing then in Brazil as anti-Semitism.
Can you speak a little bit more about that?
There was no anti-Semitic sentiment in Brazil. There was no such thing as Jewish persecution or any kind of expression of hate against Jews. There's no such thing in Brazil. Now it's starting lifting its head. Its ugly, hideous head, now it's lifting a little bit because of this Israeli-Palestine war, which you also feel it happening, I guess, in the States by what I read. But in those days, no such thing. And in Brazil also, I would say it's a momentary happening. It won't last long. Brazilians are not discriminating people.
And before you got to Brazil, did you stop in any locations before making it to Sao Paulo?
No, it was directly from Salzburg, which was Austria, to Sao Paulo.
And so you spoke a little bit about what your mother and you thought that Brazil was going to be before you arrived. What were your first impressions when you got there?
Different from Europe, very different from Europe. The languages, uh, people who were working at the pension where we were, the different people, lower level people. Because if you are in Europe, even people who are employees, let's say waiters or cooks or maid servants, they were more or less not much lower level than you yourself were. You see, it's more or less the same level of cultural level. I mean here, but in Brazil, no. In Brazil, unfortunately, people who are lower level, maid servants and things like this, they have cultural levels which are unacceptable. And those days, it was even worse. See? So that gave us certain problems. Not that I'm trying to discriminate. I'm against discrimination of any sort. But you can't help it. You can't talk to anybody about about anything else. You have no communication.
What kind of problems did it arise from this situation?
I don't understand you.
You mentioned that there were some problems that happened because of this. What were some of the problems that happened?
Well, one of the problems was this I told you just now. You see? Um, and no, nothing else happened because I made friends quite easily. Children make friends easily. And that's so that was not really a big problem. We got used to it. And the very fact that there was no discrimination in Brazil, that very fact was a tremendous, uh, a tremendous relief for us. Nobody asks what religion you are. Religion is not a main point in a document. You just live your life and live it the way you can, and nobody has anything to do with your life. If you are Jew or not Jew or this or that, that was very happy. This was something very happy to happen to us.
And when you got to Brazil, you mentioned that you arrived in Sao Paulo. And you also mentioned that there were some people that you already kind of knew that were already here in Brazil. Can you tell me a little bit about the people that you already knew that were in Sao Paulo?
Not really much. Some were nice people, some were not. Some helped me, some didn't help us. I mean, some didn't. But no important story to tell. There were Hungarians that helped us in the beginning to speak the language. And I think they gave a job to my mother too. One of them, I think, gave a job to my mother. She had a shop somewhere. But there's not much else I can say.
And where would you live in when you were in Sao Paulo?
First, we lived in a pension, small pension. Then we lived in a rented apartment. And then my mother got married. And we moved to my stepfather's house. That was a house already. And then, of course, life started to flow slowly and foreseeably.
And how was it that your mother met your stepfather, Waltman?
Somebody introduced them.
Was he also from Europe?
Also Hungarian. He is also a Hungarian, but he was in Brazil already for 10, 15 years. He came back. He came to Brazil before the war, or 20 years maybe. He came before the war. But soon after, about 4 or 5 years after, he met my mother. He died. But by that time, my mother inherited some goods from him. And so our lifestyle didn't quite change.
And you mentioned before that once your mother married him, things kind of eased up a little bit. Can you tell me a little bit about that life change that happened?
Oh, yeah, look, first of all, I had food on the table, and edible food on the table, which is important to mention. I got, let's say, better clothing, and more important, I got to private schools, and of course, education was much better in private schools than at public schools. And so I had a good schooling. I got into university, and I graduated in business administration. And so life came to, let's say, a more moderate middle class standard.
And what did Waltman do for a living?
I myself,
Oh, your stepfather.
oh, I stopped for the constructor. He constructed buildings. He was an, he wasn't an engineer. He constructed by financing buildings, constructions.
And before you mentioned that for you it was easy to do friends, to make friends. Can you tell me a little bit about those interactions that you might have had in school with the local Brazilian population, or how did you feel about it?
Well, look, of course, when I got to business administration, that was people who were around me were also middle class and higher middle class people because it was very expensive. It was Michigan State University in Brazil. The teachers were still Michigan State University teachers, and the teaching was done in English. That's how I learned my English. And so it was let's say, very, it was easy to interact with people who were of same class as by that time we were. But the interesting thing was when I graduated, I got into a company called Unilever. You know Unilever, you have it in the States. And I speak very good, by that time I was speaking very good English. So I got into Unilever and I was working there. And there I found a person, a black person, and he became my friend. It was the first time I ever made friendship with a colored person. This was very interesting because I was not discriminating against colored people, but I had no chance to meet somebody who was colored and with whom I can have a good conversation. There were the educational level and the cultural level of these peoples, unfortunately, it's not quite so anymore. But in those days, it was very low. But this guy, this chap I had made friendship with in the Unilever, came from Bahia state, it was a northern state of Brazil, Bahia. And he had a good schooling there. He did university there. He was an economist. He came to Sao Paulo in order to, he was a musician. He liked music very much, but his parents told him the following: look, with music, you won't make any money. They thought so. So do something university wise, so they can earn a living if worse comes to worse. And so he became as economist, came to Sao Paulo. He got his job in Unilever, and but he continued to study and do music. He was playing guitar very well, and he continued music and became very good friends. We went out together at lunchtime at our jobs. We always had lunch together and all. And then one day he said, look, I think I'm going to make my future in a great, a challenging, what it's called, a challenging competition, musical competition in a television station. And he went and he won the first place. And his name, you may have heard of him, was Gilberto Gil. Have you ever heard of him?
I have not.
I'm sorry. Gilberto Gil is one of the most important composers in Brazil of bossa nova. You know bossa nova, don't you? Yeah. Well, he was bossa nova composer, and he became world famous, and became a cultural minister of Brazil at a certain stage. So he is a tremendous career. Today he is part of the Brazilian Academy of Sciences, I think it is, letters or something like that. He became a tremendously well-known and very well mentioned person in Brazil. And he was become my good friend. Of course, this friendship afterwards petered off because we were so completely different. By that time, he was composing music and was in musical circles. And I was in a completely different circle of friends. But still, we were very good friends at the time. Gilberto Gil was his name.
So then, when you were in Brazil, were you spending more time with other people that had come from Europe, Hungary, or were you spending more time with local population?
Yeah, slowly and gradually, I became friend with local people. Well, the first friends I had were all Hungarians and Germans and so on. But for let's say, gradually, I became a part of the Brazilian society. Even today, I have some Hungarian friends.
And how was the experience of, at this time you're around 14 years old. How was the daily experience for you at 14 arriving to a new country and kind of encountering everyone and all this new culture and new language? How was that for you?
Well, just like in Austria, worse than in Austria, worse than in Austria. Um, it was terribly hard to get used to a country with different customs, different habits, even eating habits were different. For example, here in Brazil, we mix rice and beans. And that was for me unheard of. I mean, only pigs ate things mixed up, food mixed up. Only pigs eat this, like in a pig style. And for me, it was something unacceptable. They have different interests than I had, different cultures. I couldn't speak the language. I couldn't go to school. Any other thing you want to know? I think this is about enough. It was very hard for me to get to. But in about 2 years' time, I could speak Brazilian, Portuguese good enough to be able to be understood. It's a horrible accent, but I spoke very well.
And in the 1950s, by the time that you arrived, Getulio Vargas had returned for his second term as president in Brazil. Do you remember how the local population spoke about Vargas?
Spoke about what?
About Getulio Vargas?
Se entendeu? What? They spoke about what?
About Vargas. He was
Getúlio Vargas, the president of Brazil. I didn't expect this question, I'm sorry. Well, what can I say? It was part of the population loved him, and the other part of the population hated him, and then he committed suicide, as you know. And by that time, I was already elderly. When was that? In 1950. It was much later that he committed suicide. I don't quite remember the year. I think in 45, 45, 44, 45, he committed suicide. And then a new president was elected, and life came back to normal. To the point where he was, when democracy was murdered in Brazil. That became bad again.
and period under Vargas, did you notice people, how are people speaking about it, or how is how are people interacting with him in his second term?
Look, his second term, you mean, when he was elected president. Look, the population was divided. Many people around me hated his guts because he was called a left-winger communist, and so he wasn't a communist, but he was quite left-winger. He was an opportunist, but he was not, I wouldn't say he was a very bad president. But anyway, he was a left-winger, and people didn't like him for that. And so very many people didn't like him. But it wasn't really relevant. It wasn't really relevant. For us, refugees, the relevant things were two. First of all, he shouldn't be an anti-Semite, and he wasn't really. And second place, he shouldn't be a communist, and he wasn't. That was important for us.
And as a young teenager, do you participate in any political organizations, or what were you interested about during this time?
I was always interested more in humanistic subjects than in technical subjects. I did business university, I was this business administration because we were rock poor, as I told you. Already we weren't, because my mother was already married to this new husband of hers and my stepfather. So we weren't really rock poor anymore. But was still, the Damocles sword was still above our head. We were afraid that I wouldn't be able to make it, in business life or in whatever else life. And so I chose business administration because I was afraid of my future. I should go back to that old days when I had problems with everything to survive. And so I studied business administration, but I shouldn't have. It wasn't really my subject. I wouldn't say I repented myself, because I did a good career as a businessman. I did a good career as a businessman. But I loved humanistics. I wrote a book when I was 11 years old. What else do you want? And so I loved humanistic subjects. And so in 1960, after I finished business administration and I had myself a good job, this was important, I started studying philosophy, of all things. It's a completely unreliable subject for somebody who wants to survive economically. But by then I had a good job, I was earning good money, so why not? And I started studying philosophy. And I started writing also again, see? And so I became, let's say, a two-sided person. One side was a monetaristic person, and the other side was a humanistic person. Then, yeah.
And how, so you mentioned that the reason why you decided to do business was thinking about the past, and then later on you were able to study philosophy a little bit. And have you been able to incorporate that philosophy aspect since studying it in your own business and in your life?
Yes, certainly so. I used to write a little bit when I was in business. I had my own business by that time. I wrote a little, but I had problem with Brazilian literature. You see, I wasn't writing very well in Brazilian, and English also not. And so I had problems with it. But yet I had some success. I must say I had some success in writing. And then in 2017 I would say about 7, 8 years ago, I decided to leave business life aside because I was fed up with it. I was fed up because I was old enough by that time. I had, let's say, a reasonable economy, spared money. And so I decided to sell my business and retire. I had a right to retire being 78 years old, more or less. I also had a failing, health failing. I had a stroke. I had a stroke. And so I decided to leave business life. And I closed my business. I sold my business to my partner, and I ended up with it. And then I started writing in serious. I started writing books really seriously. By that time, I think I learned Portuguese good enough to be able to write good literature, good Brazilian literature. At the same time, there are two organizations, Jewish organizations in Brazil. One is also in the States. One is called Stand With Us. Stand With Us, I don't know if you ever heard of it. It's a Jewish organization whose finality, which is aim, is to combat discrimination, any kind of discrimination. And I'm giving lessons, lectures, and seminars against discrimination. Of course, I give these seminars against anti-Semitism, but any kind of discrimination is hateful to us. And also the Holocaust Memorial, where I also do the same thing. And so I'm living now as a retired person, but at the same time, I'm living as a lecturer against these things, and also as a writer. And my first book is going to come out in May, which is less than a month from now. That's my first. I've already published before, but this one is a very good publishing company decided to publish my book. Very good publishing company, and I have my literary agents who help me a lot, and so I'm being assisted by many people.
And you mentioned that you went to university and you started working. Can you tell me a little bit about your working experience?
Yeah, I started off in various companies. I say Unilever was one of them, and many other companies, mostly German companies. German, why? Because I was one of very few people in Brazil who had two things together: business administration, graduation, and the German language. There were many, many German companies in Brazil, much more than now, for example. We had Volkswagen in Brazil. We had Volkswagen, the car company, and also Höchst, Pfizer, and so on, German companies. And so I had many German companies who were really vying for my presence. And so I worked for these companies as manager first and director as second. Then in 1974, I decided to own my own company. And I opened a company of business consultancy. I started giving consultancy to other companies. And that's what I did for 30 years. And for 30 years later, I had an offer for a new company which would bring this new technology to Brazil. These kind of things like cellular, which you needed towers to work with, and many other things which are modern technology. And I opened this company together with partners, and with this, the rest of our business lives.
And how did you meet your wife?
My wife, I met in 1967, I think it was, in 1967, by friends who introduced us. She was a well-known newspaper woman. She was working at news. She's a specialist in fashion and beauty. And in this range of subjects, she was working in various newspapers and magazines in Brazil. She was a very well-known person in their own profession. And I was doing my own stuff. And we met when we got married. And we are married now for 57 years. It's even shameful to admit this. 57 years of marriage. And then she opened her own business also as a consultant in beauty and fashion consultant. And she worked for private people who were rich, of course they could manage to pay her, and who at the same time had no ideas of how to do a makeup or how to get dressed for a, let's say, a more formal event and things like this. She's also retired by now.
And I know that when we have previously spoken, you mentioned having interactions with other Europeans that were coming to Brazil, but also, did you encounter anyone that was a perpetrator too during the Holocaust?
You mean if you had connection with somebody who had to do with Holocaust? That's my second Holocaust. Yes, I had one big formal affair with somebody who had a lot to do with Holocaust. Because you see, well, I tell you the story. When I entered Brazil, I came to Brazil, I started speaking Portuguese, let's say good enough to be able to go to school. I went to this course, let's say a language course in Portuguese. And there I met an Austrian girl, a girl who speak perfect German. Of course, she came from Austria. And I speak very good German because I lived in Austria. And we met here at school. She didn't speak good Portuguese. I didn't speak good Portuguese either. So more or less destiny threw us in the arms of each other. And she became my first girlfriend, and I became her first boyfriend. And she was very pretty, blonde, blue eyes, and so on and so forth. While we were in this course, which took more or less 9 months, 10 months, or a year maybe, I don't remember, we were very good friends, and we were boyfriend, a puppy love, what you call puppy love. And then we had finished our courses, and she went one way, and I went the other way, and we parted. I went to Australia. I forgot to tell you that I went to Australia and stayed there for about 2 years, more or less, after I finished university in Brazil. And there I did my graduate and post-graduation and so on. Then I came back to Brazil. And there was a crisis in those days in Brazil, an economic crisis, which most of the time is taking place in Brazil. And I got a job at Volkswagen, again for the same reason. Speak German very well, experience, and so on and so forth. And so I went to Volkswagen to work there. And whom do I meet at Volkswagen? The same girl. She was already a divorced woman. She had no children. I was single. And she was a secretary at Volkswagen. So soon enough, we became again boyfriend and girlfriend. But her father was also working at Volkswagen. And we had many conversations. She knew I was Jewish. I didn't know anything about her family, or very little about her family. And I couldn't care a damn less about her family. I was dating her, not the family. And I used to go to her house. I went to her house very often. We had lunch together, dinner together, and I got to know the father very well. And he was very nice, very polite, and we have a very, very, very good relationship. Then one day, she called me and said the following: "We have to separate." Well, what happened? So good together. It won't work out. We had nothing. It won't work out. We have to separate. But while she was saying it, she was crying. She was crying actually, and she was caressing me and kissing me, whatever. And she was saying that we have to separate. She never gave me an explanation. Just the fact that we have to separate. Well, first I insisted, because nobody gives the boot to a boyfriend who is by crying. It doesn't make any sense. But then we separated, I got to know my wife. I had other girlfriends. Got to know my wife. We married. And then one day, I get up in the morning and I look at the newspaper on my table and headline saying the following: one of the greatest war criminals taken prisoner in Brazil. And it was her father. Her father was nothing more and nothing less than the commander of the Treblinka death camp in Poland. I tried to sleep with this. And I knew him well. I shook his hands. I had conversations with him. I had lunch and dinner with him. And he was the head, the number one, the commander of the Treblinka death camp. And my whole family was killed in Poland. Not there necessarily, but in Poland. I can't even speak about it even now. It gets me numb even now. Well, I never heard of her again until very recently. And I try to bury this light in the depth of my conscience, in the depth of my soul, as a kind of something that can't be even mentioned. I couldn't even talk about it. It's an open wound in me. It's an open wound in me. Because you see, first of all, why did she decide to marry a Jew? And second place, why did her parents receive me in their house? And thirdly, why did she abandon me? Have you ever heard of an organization called Odessa? Well, Odessa was a protector of ancient Nazis. It may have been Odessa which discovered that she was going in study with a Jew, and possibly, Odessa was protecting the father. And maybe they called the father, maybe, I don't know, but maybe. The Odessa called the father and said, look, you have to stop this. If he ever finds out who you are, imagine what will happen. And she was obliged to give me up. Because she was crying all the time while she was doing it. Or else maybe the general president of Volkswagen, this was a German, who maybe he was giving protection to the father. And maybe he is the one who discovered it, that we're going steady. And maybe we get married. And maybe he was the one who insisted. I don't know. But she was obliged to get rid of me. And then again, the enormous question. The people who made her give me up, did they say to her that if you don't give him up, it's either we have to abandon your father or get rid of him. In other words, kill him. And maybe he saved my life. And in compensation, when I discovered that her father was taken prisoner and then extracted to Germany, I just may have had the moral obligation to telephone her and say, look, I'm so sorry about you. But I didn't do it. And this is another thing which was eating my conscience, because she was not guilty. She was going steady with me because I was a Jew, or else in spite of being a Jew. It makes a difference, the two things, you see. But she knew that I was a Jew. So what the hell? So this was one of the most life-wrecking experiences I could have in my life. It was perhaps, in a way, it was worse than the Holocaust itself. in some ways. Now, about a year ago, I did a podcast with a famous Brazilian podcaster. And this podcast was seen by something like 4 million people. 4 million people, which is a hell of a gang. And her son-in-law saw it. Her sister's son, by now a 60-year-old gentleman, he saw it. And he came to talk to me at my home, came here to my home. And we had a very polite conversation. He is a lawyer, and he's a left-wing, near communist. Imagine the Nazi son, his grandson is a near communist. It's a hell of a thing. And we had a very good communication. He said the following: look, I said, I would very much, is she alive? Yes, she is alive. And she lives in the interior of Brazil. She's by now an 86-year-old lady. And I said, I would like to talk to her, I said, because of all these things. He said, I don't think she will want to, because the family was so tremendously traumatized by those events that they don't want even to talk about anybody about it. But I'll ask her. He asked her later on, like a couple of weeks later, and she said she doesn't want to meet me. And I'm not going to force the situation. So I know where she is, I know where she lives, but I don't want to interrupt her and to talk to her about anything that has to do with the situation then. So this is the end of the story. But now I wrote this book I told you about, which is not only about her, but very much, let's say, very much her story, or my story with her. And she will discover it, that I wrote this book. And then I want to see if she will want to speak to me. Some story, isn't it?
Some story it is indeed. You mentioned that when you were both dating as adults, you had conversations and you had meals with her father. Can you talk a little bit about how these conversations were before you learned the reality of his identity?
Well, look, I'm sure that he knew also that I was a Jew, because first of all, the daughter must have told him, and second, because my name Waldman, a Hungarian with Waldman name with one N at the end, we're very, very suspicious of being Jewish, and I think she must have told him too. He also is one of the few war criminals, who never changed his name. He came to Brazil under the same name he had as a German camp commander. He never changed his name. And so I used to go to their place, and our conversations were, at the content of the conversation goes, it was a conversation as you would have with the father of your girlfriend. It's commonplace conversation. What film did you see? Whom did you meet? Where did you go to? Whatever. I don't know. It's a commonplace conversation. No conversation ever took place about the war or about anything of the sort. No conversation whatsoever. Its subject was avoided. They avoided it for obvious reasons, and I avoided it because I didn't want to hurt their feelings. I knew they were Germans, and I thought better not to talk about this. But I did talk about this a lot with the daughter, with my girlfriend. We talked a lot about it. We went to see war films. When you see a war film, you obviously have conversation of what did you live through during the war, what did I lived through during the war, and so on. But I wouldn't remember special conversations. I remember the mother one day, one of the first days when I went to their house, asked me how I managed to survive that period. But she never went into detail what kind of period she meant by it. a period, maybe aliens landed on the earth and they inaugurated a new period, or a kind of a germ kicked them to come to the surface of the earth. She never did. I said, well, we had luck. I answered simply, I had luck. That's all. And we never came back at all to this subject.
And to what, after all of this years, and you've written now also this book about your experience about going to Brazil, encountering HER2. After all of these years, to what do you attribute your survival of all of the events of the Second World War and the Holocaust?
To what I owe this survival fact. But first of all, I must answer you the same thing that I answered her mother. I was lucky. I had luck. Second, my mother made the right choices when she was with me. She made the right choices at the time we were together. And third thing is that most of my life, I tried to find out, why did I survive? And didn't the other 6 million survive? It's a question you ask yourself. I could never answer this question, never, until I wrote this book and until I started giving these lectures on discrimination. And now I do think I know it. I survived this period to be able to do this. That's what I think now. To be able to avoid it happening again. I think this is why I survived. I don't quite believe in destiny and all these things, but I do believe in it. There's such thing as a destiny. And this was to be my destiny.
And the experiences that you've had, do you think it has shaped how you raise your children?
Oh yes, very much so. I think my children were raised in the Jewish religion, not really religious, they're not religious, but they're very strong Jewish feelings I have. Very strong Jewish feelings. And that was, I don't know, maybe partly because of me.
So would you say that your religious observance changed after the war?
My religious feelings? I was never religious. I felt myself Jewish, and I felt myself more Jewish after the war, because we were persecuted. But I was never religious. But I felt myself more like being Jewish. What you call a cultural Jew. A cultural Jew, I think would be the right word for it.
And how was the process of you learning about your experience as a young child and also researching for writing your book that is going to be coming out soon?
Look, writing this book is a very, very strong experience. There is a famous Danish writer, Karen Blixen. I don't know if you've ever heard of her. Karen Blixen. And she had a phrase which is important for me. She said the following: if you have a great pain, you heal it by writing about it. And this really happened to me too. I had a great pain, which was this girl, and I started writing about it, which a great part healed my wounds. Now I can talk about this, so much so that we're talking about it now. I can even write about it. And now I discovered many things about myself, which I ignored myself. You see, you think of your previous life, you or I, you think of this previous life as photographs. You remember a certain incident, you have a photo of that incident. You remember if something else happened to you one day, it's another photo. But when you write a book, the photos became a film. Suddenly it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You discover things you never knew of yourself. You discover certain traits and certain things that happen to you which you never remembered before. A book helps you to become yourself. And this happened to me. And by strange as it means, as incredible as it can seem to you, I discovered my real Jewishness thanks to the daughter of Commander of Treblinka. Thanks to his daughter, I discovered my Jewishness. Indirectly. Or directly, I don't know.
And I know you mentioned before that now you're a Brazilian citizen.
I what?
That now you're a Brazilian citizen? You mentioned before. And I was wondering, you've now spent so many years living in Brazil. Um, you've lived there, your children were born there. How do you feel connected now with Brazil, with the country?
Totally, totally. But I still have a European culture. Background is European. The philosophy I learned is universal philosophy. It's not Brazilian philosophy, if such thing ever existed. You see, but that's a European culture, European background, but Brazilian presence. I traveled a lot too. I went to Europe. I went to the United States many times, so I'm not strange to other, let's say, my original culture. But now I am Brazilian. I write in Portuguese, I think in Portuguese, I dream in Portuguese, so I'm a Brazilian.
And something that you mentioned before that stood out to me was that you mentioned that when you got to Brazil, you didn't encounter any anti-Semitism, but that now things were changing a little bit.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Like we can. Nazism, fascism, and anti-Semitism is now quite strongly embedded in internet. You can see a lot of material on this in internet. And some of the schools which look for me to give conferences and speeches because they discovered also that some of their pupils or maybe some of their teachers are giving giving testimony on anti-Semitic subjects. You see, so that's why I'm being called, and I wish I wouldn't be because of that. And so it's quite embedded also again in cultural relationships because it's easy. It is Gaza business, this horrible Gaza business, that people are now feeling solidarity towards the Gaza Strip. And they're trying to blame, many of them blame Israel for it. I wouldn't go into this subject because of obvious reasons, but one thing is government and the other thing is state. You may be against the Israeli government, but not against the Israeli state. They do two different things. So I'm trying to separate the two things in my lectures. And I'm having some success, I hope.
And you mentioned that you're doing all of this stuff to combat the now anti-Semitism. Have you also encountered Holocaust denial in your talks or with people?
No, this is not a subject anymore. I don't think it's a. Yeah, of course there are some. Yes, I discovered some. Yes, I did, but mostly for ignorance, total ignorance, not because of strong and embedded belief. Ignorance mostly. But most of the people who question me because of the Gaza Strip business.
And we're almost nearing the end of our interview. Is there anything else you would like to add that we haven't spoken about yet?
Yes, the fact that we have to combat, we have to fight all that we have suffered for. I had 3 or 4 experiences with discrimination. One in a fascist government, a second in a Nazi government, a third in a communist government, and the fourth in governments which didn't recognize a woman's capability of raising a family. Discrimination against women. I had the pleasure of 4 discriminations, living through it, 4 discriminations. And so I'm against, 100% against any kind of discrimination that you can invent or imagine. And this is what I'm fighting for. And this is what everybody else has to fight for. This is my last message I would like to give.
And finally, what would you like to tell future generations?
Never again, never again. This is what I want to tell you. Never again what happened before.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. Also, if anything you want to know about, talk to me about, you talk to me, right?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. See ya.
Well, I think we can.
This is a very, very sad photo here. Very sad photo. This lady here is my father's mother, my grandmother, my father's mother. She was murdered. And this is myself. She was murdered with all the rest. What?
What was her name?
I don't remember. There's another sad story. I don't even remember it. You see, my father's side, they were in the interior of Hungary. I hardly saw them. Because after a certain moment, 41, 42, it was dangerous for Jews to go and trip to the interior. So we restricted it very much. This is one of the few pictures taken. This is the one I remember. She was my grandmother. Well, this is my book. This is the book I'm going to, it's going to be launched on 2nd of May, this May, next month. And this is the story which, about the girl, but not only, during my war years and after the war and all that, but mostly of the girl, about the girl and our relationship and how I discovered what happened and who her father was and what I felt and what I imagined doing and thinking and so on. It's quite psychological, disorderly book. Disorderly because it's not an orderly psychological book. It's very neurotic. Here, when I arrived in Brazil, must be about 14, 15 years old here, something of the sort. I know where this was taken. I know, and who took it was the girl, or the commander's daughter. She took this picture.
So was this in Sao Paulo?
Yeah, in São Paulo. We always were in São Paulo. We never traveled. In São Paulo.
And when she took the photograph, were you already boyfriend and girlfriend, or were you still friends?
I don't remember. I think we were starting to go steady when she took this photo.
And do you remember that day?
I know where it was taken. It's a club which I'm a member of, and I took her there to the club with me, and we took it there, but not much more.
Looks like a uniform.
Yeah, but it's not. It's by chance. So this is it. And then again, myself at the Danube, the bank of the Danube, the river. I must have been here about 4 years old, I would say, 3, 4, something of the sort. There are no dates, so I don't exactly know when, but must have been when I was 3 or 4.
You used to go a lot to the river?
How's that?
You used to go there a
Oh
lot?
yes, a river very close to our place, very close. So until the Nazis came in, we lived there more or less decent life. And so we could go around, etc. So this is one of the pictures we're taking with me when I was 3, 4 years old. I think more like 3. This is myself, must have been about 2 years old here at the Danube, riverside. Yeah, about 2 years old.
Do you remember, or have you been told of, were you there with your father and your mother that day?
No. I think I was with my uncle. I think I was with my uncle. Okay.
2, 1.
This is my mother and my father getting married. Must have been in 1934, about 1934, their marriage.
And how did you obtain this document, this photograph?
Could you repeat it?
How did you get
How
to the
did you get this photograph?
I don't remember. Somebody sent us. Some relative sent us to us. I don't remember.
And what we have in this second photograph?
This
When
is
was
the,
this photograph taken?
this was my mother's wedding ceremony, dinner, marriage dinner or something of the sort. The upper part of the picture is my father's family. And this part of the picture downward is my mother's family. And this part of the family, my father's, not one single person survived, all dead. Those up. Here I can recognize 2 or 3 people.
Can you point them?
Point them. This was my mother's cousin. This was my mother. This girl's mother. In other words, my mother's aunt. And I don't think I can point anybody else. Funnily, my mother's brother, my uncle, is not here. I don't know why. Should be here somewhere, but is not. Anyway, this picture talks by itself. Here's my mother, Here is my father, and the rest is the two families.
And from what year is this picture from?
I don't know where it came from. I don't remember. I don't remember. But I do remember what I thought when I saw it first. If these people have known what I know, they wouldn't have been here.
Cut.
This is the only picture I have of me and my father. This is myself here. I must have been here about 3, 4 years old, I think. And this is my father.
And when was this photograph taken?
It was taken in a restaurant. Must have been in 1942, I would say. 41, 42. It was taken in a restaurant. This is my grandmother, my mother's mother, and this is my uncle, who then went to Australia and became a millionaire in Australia. And these are unknown people. And it's the only photo I have of myself with my father.
And how were you able to keep this photograph? Did you bring it with you after?
Now,
afterwards?
afterwards, it came to us afterwards, but I don't remember how. Or maybe it could have come to me when I was in Hungary, visiting Hungary, visited a couple of times, may have been given to me. I don't remember. Since then, sincerely, I don't remember.